the sun began its descent toward the Armenian highlands, and Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes understood, at last, that he had been abandoned. Around him, the Seljuk cavalry wheeled in endless circles, their composite bows singing death. His own men, those who had not already fled, pressed closer together, shields raised against the darkening sky. Somewhere in the chaos, the imperial standard still stood, purple silk stained with blood and dust. The ground trembled with hoofbeats. The air carried the screams of dying horses and the war cries of warriors who spoke a language he did not know. This was not how emperors were supposed to die. Behind him, across the plateaus of eastern Anatolia, lay the heartland of Byzantium, the farms that fed Constantinople, the estates that supplied the armies, the mountain passes that had held invaders at bay for centuries. Ahead, encircling him like wolves around wounded prey, came the future. Turkish horsemen from the steppes, followers of a sultan named Alp Arslan, the valiant lion who had marched north from Persia to meet him on this field. The Battle of Manzikert had begun at dawn with confidence. It would end at dusk with the capture of an emperor and the opening of a gate that would never close. What happened in the hours between would shatter the eastern frontier of Christendom and reshape the map of the known world. The Byzantine Empire in the year 1071 was not what it had been. For 4 centuries, Constantinople had stood as the greatest city in Christendom, its walls unbreached, its emperors crowned in gold and purple, its armies the inheritors of Rome's legions. From the Danube to the deserts of Syria, from the Italian coastline to the mountains of Armenia, the empire had endured invasions, plagues, and civil wars. It had always survived, but survival had come at a cost. Through the 1060s, Byzantine politics had become a blood sport. Generals overthrew emperors. Noble families schemed against one another in the gilded halls of the Great Palace. The army, once the finest fighting force in the Mediterranean, had fractured into competing factions. The native-born Roman soldiers who followed their generals, the foreign mercenaries who fought for gold, and the provincial levies who owed loyalty to local lords more than to distant Constantinople. Into this chaos had stepped Romanos Diogenes, a Cappadocian general of noble birth, tall and strong and respected by his soldiers. He had not been born to the purple. He had married into it when the widowed Empress Eudokia chose him as her husband in 1068, making him emperor by marriage rather than by blood. The aristocratic families of Constantinople, the Dukas clan especially, had never forgiven him for that. They smiled at court, they bowed when he passed, and they waited for him to fail. Romanos knew what they whispered, that he was a soldier playing at emperor, that he had no legitimacy beyond his marriage bed, that his reign would be brief. He knew the only way to silence them was victory, and victory meant the East. For decades, Turkish horsemen had been raiding across the Armenian highlands and the plateaus of Anatolia. Not as conquerors, not yet, but as raiders. Swift, brutal strikes that burned villages, carried off captives, and vanished before Byzantine forces could respond. They came from the Seljuk Empire, a new power rising out of Persia, led by a dynasty of Turkish warlords who had converted to Islam and carved an empire from the ruins of the Abbasid Caliphate. Their current sultan, Alp Arslan, was young, capable, and ambitious. He had spent the previous years consolidating his hold on Persia and preparing for a campaign into Fatimid Egypt. He did not seek war with Byzantium, but he did not fear it either. For Romanos, the Turkish raids were both a threat and an opportunity. Anatolia was the empire's breadbasket, its military recruiting ground, the land bridge between Europe and Asia. If the Turks continued raiding unchecked, they would bleed the eastern provinces dry. But if he could crush them in a single decisive campaign, he would secure the frontier, silence his critics, and prove himself a true Emperor of Rome. In the spring of 1071, he gathered the largest army Byzantium had fielded in a generation and marched east. The army that followed Romanos into Anatolia was enormous, perhaps 60,000 men, perhaps more. Ancient accounts differ on the numbers, but all agree it was the mightiest host the empire had assembled in decades. It was also dangerously divided. At its core stood the tagmata, the professional soldiers of the Byzantine standing army, heavy cavalry in lamellar armor, disciplined infantry with spears and shields, engineers who understood siege warfare and the construction of fortified camps. These men were Romans, born and raised in the empire's heartland, loyal to the purple standard and experienced in war. Around them marched the foreign mercenaries, Normans from southern Italy, warriors in mail who fought with lance and sword, Pechenegs and Cumans from the steppes north of the Black Sea, light cavalry who rode small horses and carried bows, Frankish knights who had come east seeking fortune and glory, Armenians from the border regions whose loyalty to Constantinople was always uncertain. And then there were the levies, farmers and townsmen pressed into service, equipped with whatever weapons they could find, led by provincial nobles whose allegiance often depended on whether Constantinople paid them on time. This was not an army. It was a coalition of factions held together by imperial authority and the promise of plunder. The emperor knew this. He also knew he had no choice. To defeat the Seljuks, he needed numbers. To secure Anatolia, he needed to demonstrate strength. And to prove himself, he needed a victory so decisive that no one in Constantinople would dare question his throne again. The army marched through the spring and into summer, moving east across the Anatolian plateau. They crossed the salt desert, endured the heat, and advanced toward the Armenian highlands, where the Turkish raids had been most severe. Scouts reported Seljuk movements to the south. Alp Arslan had been preparing to invade Egypt, but word of the Byzantine mobilization had reached him. Now he was turning north. The two forces were converging. By late summer, Romanos had reached the fortress city of Manzikert, near the shores of Lake Van, in the heart of the Armenian borderlands. The city had recently fallen to Turkish raiders. The emperor intended to reclaim it, then push deeper into Seljuk territory, forcing Alp Arslan into a pitched battle where Byzantine heavy cavalry and disciplined infantry could destroy the lighter Turkish horsemen. It was a sound strategy. It assumed loyalty. In mid-August, Romanos divided his forces. He sent a large detachment under a general named Byzantine to scout ahead and secure the route north. The emperor himself would remain with the main army, besieging Manzikert and preparing for the Sultan's approach. This was the first mistake. Byzantine marched his men into broken terrain, where hills and gullies limited visibility and cavalry could not maneuver. The Seljuk scouts found him. They attacked in the way Turkish horsemen always attacked. Sudden strikes from multiple directions, volleys of arrows, then retreat before the Byzantines could form ranks. Byzantine tried to hold his ground. His army disintegrated. Some men fled. Others were cut down. Byzantine himself was captured. When word reached Romanos, he understood the danger. His army had just lost perhaps a quarter of its strength, and the Seljuks now knew exactly where he was. He did not retreat. Emperors did not retreat. Instead, he prepared for battle. Sultan Alp Arslan had not expected this war. His ambitions lay south, toward the wealth of Egypt and the holy cities of Islam. The Byzantine frontier had been quiet enough. Raiding, yes, but not conquest. The empire was weak, distracted by internal strife, no longer the superpower it had been under Basil II. There would be time to deal with Constantinople later. But when messengers brought word that Emperor Romanos himself had marched east with the largest army Byzantium had fielded in decades, Alp Arslan changed his plans. He was young, in his 30s, a warrior who had fought his way to power through the brutal politics of the Seljuk succession. His father, Chagri Beg, had been one of the founders of the empire. His uncle, Tugril, had been the first sultan. Alp Arslan had inherited their ambition and their skill. He commanded armies that moved like the wind, struck like lightning, and vanished before the enemy could respond. He marched north with his own forces, perhaps 40,000 men, perhaps fewer. Like the Byzantine army, his host was diverse. Turkish horse archers who had learned warfare on the steppes, Persian infantry who fought with spear and sword, Kurdish and Arab auxiliaries who had joined for plunder and faith. Unlike the Byzantine army, they fought as one. They followed a single leader. They shared a single purpose. By late August, the two armies were within a day's march of each other. The terrain around Manzikert was unforgiving, rolling plateaus cut by valleys, sparse vegetation, summer heat that shimmered off the rocks. To the north rose the Armenian highlands, jagged peaks that marked the edge of the known world. To the south stretched the plains that led back toward Persia and the heartland of the Seljuk Empire. Romanos had reclaimed Manzikert and positioned his army in a defensive formation, ready to meet the Sultan's advance. His plan remained the same. Draw the Seljuks into a pitched battle, use his superior numbers and heavy cavalry to crush them, then pursue the survivors back across the frontier. But Alp Arslan did not fight pitched battles unless he had no choice. On the night of August 25th, the Sultan sent envoys to the Byzantine camp. They carried an offer: peace. The Turks would withdraw. The border would be respected. No more raids. No more war. It was a test, and both men knew it. Romanos refused. He had not marched 1,000 miles to accept terms from a barbarian warlord. He had come for victory. He had come to prove himself an emperor worthy of Rome. The envoys returned to their master. Alp Arslan, it is said, dressed in white that night, the color worn by Muslim warriors who expected to die in battle. He would fight, and he would win or fall as God willed. Dawn came on August 26, 1071. The fate of empires would be decided before the sun set. The Byzantine army advanced at first light. Romanos had arranged his forces in the traditional formation: heavy cavalry on the wings, infantry in the center, the imperial guard surrounding the purple standard where the emperor himself would fight. The reserve, commanded by a nobleman named Andronikos Doukas, held the rear, ready to exploit any breakthrough or cover a retreat. The plan was simple: advance in formation, close with the enemy, use weight and discipline to break the lighter Turkish horsemen, then pursue and destroy. It assumed the enemy would stand and fight. The Seljuk army appeared on the horizon like a sandstorm given shape. Thousands of horsemen in loose formations, banners snapping in the wind, the sound of drums and horns carrying across the plain. They did not charge. They did not form ranks. They simply waited. Romanos gave the order. The Byzantine army moved forward. The Turks retreated. It was the oldest tactic in the steppe playbook, refined over centuries of warfare against settled kingdoms. Draw the enemy forward, stretch their lines, exhaust their horses, then strike. The Byzantines advanced for hours. The sun climbed higher. The heat became oppressive. Men in heavy armor sweated under their mail and lamella. Horses tired. The formations began to spread as faster units pulled ahead and slower ones fell behind. And still the Turks retreated, always just out of reach. Then the arrows began. Seljuk horse archers wheeled in wide arcs around the Byzantine flanks, loosing volleys from composite bows that could pierce mail at 200 paces. They fired, then galloped away before the Byzantine cavalry could respond. They struck from the left, then the right, then the rear. They targeted officers, horses, anyone who stood out. The Byzantines tried to close the distance. Their heavy cavalry charged, lances lowered, expecting to scatter the lighter horsemen. But the Turks simply rode away, faster than the armored Byzantine horses could follow. When the charge exhausted itself, the arrows resumed. Romanos understood what was happening. This was not a battle, it was a hunt, and his army was the prey. He tried to pull back, to consolidate his forces and retreat to a defensive position. But the army had advanced too far. The formations had become strung out, units had lost contact with one another, and the Seljuks, sensing weakness, began to press harder. The afternoon wore on. Men fell, horses collapsed, the Byzantine line began to fracture. And then, as the sun slipped toward the western horizon, Andronikos Doukas made his decision. Andronikos Doukas commanded the reserve, the fresh troops who had not yet entered the battle, the soldiers who could turn the tide if committed at the right moment. He was also a member of the Doukas family, the aristocratic clan that had ruled Constantinople before Romanos seized the throne. He had smiled at the emperor's coronation. He had bowed when given command. And now, with the army bleeding and the Sultan closing in, he saw his opportunity. Accounts differ on what happened next. Some say he received false intelligence that the emperor had already fallen and the battle was lost. Others say he simply made the calculation. Romanos was doomed, the army was doomed, and there was no point dying for a usurper emperor. Whatever his reasons, he withdrew. The reserve turned and marched away from the battlefield, leaving the emperor's forces exposed and unsupported. When Romanos saw the banners of the reserve disappearing to the west, he understood that he had been abandoned, not by cowards fleeing a lost battle, but by a rival who had chosen this moment to ensure his fall. The Seljuk cavalry sensed the collapse. They stopped feinting, they stopped harassing, they charged. From all sides they came, thousands of horsemen converging on the exhausted, isolated Byzantine center. The heavy cavalry tried to form a defensive circle. The infantry raised their shields. The emperor himself fought in the front ranks, sword in hand, refusing to flee. But there was nowhere to flee to. The sun set. The fighting continued in the gathering dusk. Men stumbled over bodies. Horses screamed. The purple standard swayed and fell and was raised again. The emperor's guard died around him, one by one, until there were not enough left to hold the line. Somewhere in the chaos, a Turkish arrow found Romanos's horse. The animal collapsed. The emperor fell. Seljuk warriors closed in, recognizing the imperial armor, the purple cloak, the man who had refused every offer of peace. They took him alive. When dawn came on August 27th, the battlefield was silent. Bodies lay scattered across the plateau. Byzantine and Seljuk, Christian and Muslim, men who had marched 1,000 miles to die in a place most had never heard of. Broken weapons littered the ground. Riderless horses wandered among the dead. Vultures circled overhead. The Byzantine army had ceased to exist. Some units had fled west during the night, abandoning their weapons, their wounded, their emperor. Others had surrendered. Still others had been hunted down by Turkish cavalry in the hours after the battle, cut down as they ran. In the Seljuk camp, Sultan Alp Arslan stood before his captive. Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes, ruler of Byzantium, heir to Caesar and Constantine, knelt in the dust before a Turkish warlord in white robes. His armor was dented and stained, his face was bruised, his empire lay in ruins behind him. The Sultan, it is said, placed his foot on the emperor's neck, a ritual humiliation, the symbolic submission of Rome to the Turks. Then he raised him up. They spoke through translators. The terms were generous: a ransom, a treaty, a promise of peace. Alp Arslan did not want to occupy Anatolia. He wanted to secure his northern frontier so he could return to his Egyptian campaign. He released Romanos after a week, sending him back to Constantinople with an escort and a treaty. But the empire Romanos returned to no longer wanted him. The Ducas family had already seized power in the capital, placing a child emperor on the throne and declaring Romanos a usurper who had lost his right to rule the moment he lost the battle. Within months, he would be deposed, blinded, and exiled to a monastery where he would die of his wounds. The eastern frontier, stripped of its defenders, lay open. Turkish clans that had followed Alp Arslan north did not return south. They saw the empty lands, the undefended cities, the vacuum where Byzantine power had been. They stayed. They sent for their families. They began to settle. Within a decade, Anatolia, the heartland of Byzantium, the land that had fed the empire and supplied its armies for 7 centuries, would be lost. Not through conquest, not through a planned invasion, but through the slow, inevitable migration of pastoral nomads into lands that no longer had the strength to resist them. The gate had been opened at Manzikert. It would never close. In the silence that followed the battle, the map of the world had changed. An emperor knelt in the dust. An empire began its long, slow collapse. And the horsemen from the east, who had come as raiders and stayed as conquerors, looked west toward new horizons. The sun rose over the battlefield. The dead did not answer its call, and Anatolia, which had been Roman for 1,000 years, began to forget the name of Rome.